This is the first Sunday of the season of creation, so it makes sense that we're starting at the very beginning. The Bible starts with a creation account. It says that the entire universe was created in 7 days. We heard the story of the first 4 days today. Thank you, Peter, for that reading. The opening words tell us that in the beginning there was heaven, and there was earth, and there was formless water. So we already know that we're in deep trouble with this account. Science has made it very clear to us that the universe did not start with the earth already there and water already there, but rather the earth only appeared about 4.5 billion years ago. And even then, it didn't have water on it right away. The universe had begun some 13.8 billion years before. So Genesis is off to a really bad start. It's just left too much out, and it started too late. And there are other problems too. God's first creation is light. But, as we heard, stars aren't created until the 4th day of creation. So where is that light coming from? Christians traditionally and Jews have interpreted this mystically, that God created a kind of spiritual light that suffuses the universe, which is an interesting interpretation, but doesn't seem to address what the text purports to be about, which is the creation of the physical universe. So as the West became more aware of the natural world and our science became more advanced, people became increasingly skeptical about the Genesis account of creation and decided, politely and impolitely sometimes, to set it aside. And now we rely on scientists to give our idea of how the universe actually began. Most people today look to science, and it presents a very, very different idea of how the universe was born. That explanation rests on the theory of the Big Bang. It suggests that the universe began with an enormous explosion which hurled matter and galaxies outward, and the result is the world that we see in the sky today. Here's an image from the new James Webb Space Telescope, which has been providing images just since July. It shows just some of the 200 billion galaxies out there. This is just a tiny, tiny sliver of sky that we see here, and most of those lights are galaxies. And each of those galaxies contains hundreds of millions of stars. The universe is astonishingly large and populated, much bigger and more complex than the Genesis account provides. For most people, this proves that we can safely set aside the religious account as quaint and irrelevant. But in reality, the line between religion and science is actually a good deal blurrier than that. The Big Bang Theory got its start in the 1920s. Back then, everyone, including Albert Einstein, believed that the universe was fixed. Its size today is the size it had always been. And because his equations, his relativity equations, didn't say that, he introduced a cosmological constant into them to make sure that the universe would stay stable and the same size. But that was an assumption, not a fact. This young man, standing to the left of Albert Einstein, is the Belgian Catholic priest Georges Lemaitre. He had a different interpretation of Einstein's equations. He studied them, and he went, I think that something is wrong here. He was both a priest and a physicist. He got his PhD from MIT during this period in the 1920s. And in 1927, he looked at Einstein's equations and realized that Einstein had it wrong about the universe and its size. The way gravity worked in relativity theory suggested that the universe must be expanding. Otherwise, gravity would cause it to come together and just collapse into a singularity, what people now call a big crunch. So if the galaxies in the sky, or rather if everything in the sky is moving apart, That suggests that if you could turn time backwards, rewind the tape, things that were moving away from each other would move closer and closer and closer to each other. And Lemaitre realized that the universe that Einstein had captured in his relativity equations suggested that all of matter in this universe started off in a single place, in a single point, at a single point in time, at the beginning of time itself. It must have all started with what we now call a Big Bang. At the same time as this priest was imagining the Big Bang on paper, curious physical evidence was being discovered. Today, we know the word Hubble from the Hubble Space Telescope, but the reason it has that name is because of what Edwin Hubble did in the 1920s. In the early 1920s, he was working on a new fancy telescope which had the ability to actually see that some stars were not stars at all, but they were galaxies. 1923, he was the first one to realize that that point of light in the sky is Andromeda, is actually the Andromeda galaxy, not an Andromeda star. And this was the beginning of the realization that our galaxy, the Milky Way, is just one of many. But there was something else in the photographs that Hubble took. He realized that the galaxies seemed to be moving away from us. It was the first physical proof that anybody had that if they're moving away now, maybe they'd all been together originally. So there was scientific evidence coming through telescopes in the 1920s at the same time as Lemaitre was figuring out from the equations that there must have been a Big Bang. Back then, there was resistance to this idea. Through the 30s and the 40s and the 50s, people resisted the idea of the Big Bang, partially because it was conceived by a Catholic priest. And scientists did not want to be seen having come this far away from religion just to be pulled back and say, actually, it's the religious guy with the right answer. But as science matured and it gathered more and more evidence, it became clear that, in fact, Lemaitre's idea was correct, that the universe had started at a single point and then exploded outwards. It's now the reigning theory of how the universe began. Lemaitre died in 1966, but the Vatican still has a staff astronomer and still runs its own observatory. Today, the theory of the Big Bang is much better developed, and it contains some really curious elements. It suggests that the fabric of reality, what Einstein called space-time, simply winked into reality spontaneously one moment. There was nothing, and then poof, there was something. That doesn't bother scientists, because in their particle accelerators, they have discovered that particles and antiparticles are constantly winking in and out of resistance. You know, in old high school math, 1 plus minus 1 equals 0, right? The minus 1 and the 1 cancel each other out, so it's as though they were never there. Well, the same thing is happening in reality all the time. In this room, the room where you're sitting at home, particle-antiparticle pairs like electrons and positrons are winking into existence, then canceling each other out. Over and over and over again. This is constantly happening. The emptiness of space isn't empty at all. It is full of particles going, "Ah, I'm alive!" and then disappearing. Over and over and over again, all the time. It's weird, but it's real, and they've measured it in the particle accelerators because they can tell the influence of these particle-antiparticle pairs on other particles which last longer. They lurch to one side because they're beside a virtual particle briefly, and then they come back. So something must have been there. So if matter is constantly winking in and out of reality, then the scientists say, why shouldn't the entire universe have begun that way when it was incredibly small? When the Big Bang first occurs, the scientists tell us it was incredibly hot. So hot that the particles which poof into existence can last, but are unable to clump into matter. The universe begins as a hot soup of subatomic particles, all traveling so fast, like near the speed of light, that they can't possibly bind together to make atoms. So imagine a universe full of particles, too small to see, all smashing into each other and passing by each other, a sort of formless sea of particles. And then the other thing which they've discovered in those particle accelerators is if you take two protons and you spin them really, really fast and you smash them together, protons will let off light. It's the same sort of thing which happens when you have a campfire, right? You apply some fire to the wood, chemical bonds start to break in the wood, that lets off heat and light. E equals mc squared. Matter is just frozen energy. So break the bonds, light comes out. So let's just take stock of that for a minute. In the first milliseconds of creation, scientists are telling us that there was a formless, surging sea of particles, and suddenly there was a flash of light. Not that different than the Genesis account, when you think about it. A formless sea and suddenly light. As the universe expanded, the light, that first light, its frequency stretched. So if you imagine a balloon, you blow up a balloon, it gets bigger. It's the same. The balloon has no new matter in it. It just gets bigger. That's what the universe is like. Space-time itself grew. So it's not that there is already a big empty universe and galaxies and matter exploded into it. No, the actual size of the universe grew. When it grew, it stretched that first light. So it started off at a really high frequency, and then as the universe grew, that high frequency light became lower and lower and lower frequency light. And it's still with us. It's right here, right now. You can't detect it with your senses because we don't detect microwaves. But for those of us who are old enough to remember television before cable, remember as you would switch through the channels, there'd be channels where there was something on, and there'd be channels where there was nothing on. There'd just be static. 1% of that static is the light left over from the beginning of the universe. When you flip through the FM dial when you're driving around or if you're listening at home, you come across the static in between radio stations. Part of that is the static of light that was used to be high energy light, became visible light, then stretched out far enough that now it's just static because it's down at the radio frequencies, microwave frequencies actually. So we are all actually bathing right now in the first light of the universe. It is still with us. And this is a picture of what it looks like. So this is not what it looks like at the optical level, but in the microwave level. This is the cosmic background radiation, and it's all the same everywhere in the universe, which suggests that it all started in the same place, that singular point, once upon a time. Although most scientists agree that the universe started with this Big Bang, there's still some details that they don't understand. One of them is, for the universe to exist as it does, there must have been an instant early on when the fabric of space suddenly expanded from the size of a proton to the size of a football. This is called the Inflationary Period. No one understands how that happened, they just know that it did. Also, for galaxies to hold together the way they are, they must be surrounded by a type of matter that is invisible to us. It's colloquially called dark matter, but it's actually not dark, it's just invisible. There may be dark matter all around us right now, no one's sure. It's just something that they know must exist for the world and the universe to be the way it appears to be, but they don't know what it is. And it makes up most of the matter in the universe. So when people tell you science has got it all figured out, no, they don't. And they'll be the first to admit it. They do not have it all figured out. But they do have explanations which work very well, but there's still some very big question marks on the scientific agenda. There's an even more troubling problem, though. If the force of gravity at the beginning of the universe had been just a little bit stronger, all those particles would have clumped together. So that's what gravity does, right? It pulls things together. So if it had been a little bit stronger, the universe, when it started expanding, the matter wouldn't have gone out with it. It would have just clumped together and stayed near the origin point. Conversely, if gravity had been just a little bit weaker, as the universe started expanding, matter, those particles, wouldn't have come together as stars, and thus we wouldn't have galaxies. If gravity's too weak, things don't clump. If gravity's too strong, everything clumps, and you don't get a universe. Either way, you don't get the kind of universe that we have now, which has given rise to people like us. So why were the settings just right for creating us? This is a riddle called the Anthropic Principle, and there's a couple of answers to it. One is the weak Anthropic Principle. Why does the universe just happen to have the right settings so that we can talk about it? Well, because we're talking about it. What other universe would you expect to have this conversation in but the one that's got the settings that allows you to exist? Right? So it's a tautology. We can only have this conversation in a universe that has the right settings. Okay, that makes sense. But scientists don't believe. Scientists say, okay, if we've got the right settings and we believe that the universe gave us these settings by chance, why are we in the universe with the right settings? And the answer to that question is, well, there must be other universes with other settings. So as much as you may think that the Marvel universe created the whole idea of the multiverse, it's not true. Long before Doctor Strange, there were other doctors, physicists, who said, you know, the only logical answer to this problem is there must be other universes where gravity's too strong, too weak, where the forces inside the atom are stronger and weaker, so that you can have all sorts of parallel universes, and we're not special. We just happen to be the one that brings matter together in such a way that intelligent life can evolve so we can talk about these things. There are other universes next to us where nothing evolves because the settings were different. That's the weak Anthropic Principle. The strong Anthropic Principle says you have no proof of any of those parallel universes. You know, it's a lot to ask. I'm going to create multiple universes to fix my equation. The only logical answer is some being set up the settings so this would happen. That's the strong Anthropic Principle. Problem for scientists is there's no proof to either one of these scenarios. They don't have access to parallel universes, and there's nothing they can do to look through their telescopes or their microscopes to find the being who created the settings so that we could have the universe that we have. So scientists shrug and say, let's move on to discovering something new. Let the philosophers worry about this. And the theologians. So here at the beginning of the 21st century, when most people assume that science has superseded religion, we're faced with a conundrum. Scientists have adopted a theory of the universe created by a Catholic priest. They don't like to admit it, but that's where this started. This theory of the origin of the universe can't actually explain why it happened. Science also can't explain why the settings of the universe are exactly right for us to be having this conversation, even when being in just the right universe completely defies chance. Faced by these mysteries, should we just double back and return to Genesis and say, okay, maybe the good book had it right? Well, I wouldn't go there. There's too much in the good book, especially in Genesis, that gets it wrong. As we heard Peter read, it wasn't until the third day, it was on the third day of creation that plants were introduced to the earth and stars were introduced to the earth the day after. So apparently there was greenery on the earth even before the sun existed. Well, no. That definitely didn't happen. I admit that I find it inspiring that we're all walking in the light of the first day, bathed in creation's invisible light. But it gets too much wrong. We can't just point to Genesis and say, all the answers are there. But what Genesis does get right is more intangible and not something that you can put into an equation. The Genesis account presents the creation of the universe as poetry. And it sounds beautiful. Then God said, "Let there be light." And there was light. And God saw that the light was good. And God separated the light from the darkness. God called the light day and the darkness night. And there was evening, and there was morning, the first day. It's written as poetry on purpose to inspire us, to give us the reassurance that the universe has order and beauty, that should be our first assumption. To call the universe out of nothing is a wondrous act. And more than this, unlike the scientists' equations, Genesis encourages us to see that the universe is worthy of our admiration and wonder. As each day ends, we're told that God said, "And it was good." The Big Bang doesn't come with that coda. Scientists don't take a position on whether the Big Bang is good or not, or whether the universe is good or not. But we human beings need some indication about what our general attitude towards reality will be. And Genesis says, there is order, and there is beauty, and it is good. It's our ability to wonder, to sigh in appreciation when we see the Milky Way, that makes science possible at all. If we thought the universe was just out to get us, was fundamentally hostile, then why would any scientist spend all night long staying up, drinking coffee, looking at the night sky? There'd be no point. It would just be all scary dragons, and I don't want to know. But instead, our text has inspired Western culture to give even the most atheistic scientist that impulse to believe that, give the universe the benefit of the doubt. It is good and it is beautiful. And that's why Genesis starts using words of poetry. It's not something that can be proven. It's a choice about how we are going to approach life. So let science and faith continue to walk together, trading notes, debating, disagreeing, coming together in surprising ways. We are called to walk together in wonder in a universe that was bathed in light even before the first star shone. Amen.